The Florentine philosopher and statesman Niccolò Machiavelli broke with the classical virtue politics of Plato, Aristotle, Rome, and medieval Christianity. While he's most famous for his amoral The Prince, Machiavelli also wrote the Discourses, which supported republicanism. He was a political realist, but he admired civic republicanism. His lasting contribution, though, was to turn political theory from a description of the ideal polity to a description of the functioning of actual states, and to raise the question of whether political leadership can be moral at all. Machiavelli is arguably the first modern political philosopher and political scientist. He was a Renaissance thinker whose life mostly predates the Protestant Reformation of 1517. So his manner of theorizing is quite different from the more modern thinkers like Hobbes and Locke that will follow. He lived in a very competitive commercial city-state of Catholic Italy, with the most advanced banks in the world. His experiences were as worldly and complex as his thought. He was a Florentine from a prominent family. He received what was then called a humanist education, focusing more on the classics, the ancient Greek and Roman classics, than scholasticism. He had heard lectures by Girolamo Savonarola, a friar who was hanged as a heretic. Machiavelli held many posts in a time of convulsive politics. When the Pope was an explicitly political figure, the Italian city-states were jostling for power, and invasions by France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Emperor were forces to be reckoned with. In Florence, he served as head of the chancery, organized the militia, went on diplomatic missions, met and observed the ruthless Cesare Borgia. When the Florentine Republic was overthrown by the Medici family in 1512, he was imprisoned, tortured, then exiled, at which point he wrote both his two most famous works, The Prince and the Discourses. Later, he worked for one of the Medici cardinals and two Medici popes and reviewed Florence's fortifications. After the Republic was restored, its leaders didn't trust him for the favors he received from the Medici. He died shortly after of natural causes. He was enormously controversial in his day and still is in ours. We'll see that Machiavelli's two famous books, The Prince and the Discourses, written at the same time, are very different. It can be argued that Machiavelli, of all authors, tailored his message to his audience, and the audience shifted. Now, in fact, I believe the argument of The Prince can fit inside the Discourses without much difficulty. It can be consistent with it. Nevertheless, it has to be noted that The Prince is dedicated to Lorenzo de' Medici in hopes that, quote, if your magnificence will turn your eyes at some time from the summit of your high position toward these lowlands, you will realize to what degree I unjustly suffer a great and continuous malevolence of fortune, unquote. Then, Machiavelli dedicated the Discourses to two friends who were not princes, but, quote, deserved to be, unquote. So we can't forget that Machiavelli was a real political actor hedging his bets in a dangerous time of shifting powers. That was the water he had to swim in. Now, Machiavelli held that governments are either principalities, monarchies, or republics. He wrote one book for each. Machiavelli is most famous for The Prince, published in 1532 after his death. The Prince is advice to princes. Machiavelli explicitly says it's advice for dealing with reality, not for forming an ideal state. He is giving advice for real, not imaginary politics. That's what he calls it. It is secular and practical. He's very open about this. He knows he's discussing politics in a new way, unlike Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, all the writers of the past. This is already a break with ancient and medieval political theory, whose aim was to describe the virtues that the just society and just ruler must foster. Machiavelli self-consciously abandoned that task. You could call him the first modern empirical social scientist. He studies famous historical cases, draws conclusions about what tactics are most effective, and gives his advice. And his advice is famously amoral. The main concern of a prince is gaining and remaining in power. He is famous for holding that, quote, the ends justify the means, unquote, which seems to justify power politics without morality at all. Machiavelli's statements are legendary. One quote is, "Men must either be pampered or crushed, because they can get revenge for small injuries, but not for fatal ones," unquote. Another, "There is nothing so self-defeating as generosity," or even, "There is no avoiding war." Machiavelli continued, "A prince must, quote, study war above all things," and famously, "It is better to be feared than to be loved." Machiavelli argued that the prince must literally, quote, understand how to make a nice use of the beast in man, that is, in himself. He must learn how not to be good. Just one example. When a very unpopular task needs to be done, Machiavelli suggests a special advisor should be appointed to make the needed changes. So if the people hate them afterwards, you can claim ignorance of his activities and execute the advisor. He emphasizes the importance of virtu. This means excellence, in this case, not necessarily moral virtue. He also recognizes that all this depends on circumstances. Different circumstances demand different actions, and all depends on luck or fortuna. Princes strive for glory above all, but whether they achieve it is half dependent on their ability or virtue and half on fortuna. But because fortuna is, he wrote, a woman, she will yield to the impetuous or aggressive, who, quote, command her with more audacity, unquote. Now, clearly, this is political realism. Realism is, as I mentioned in the last lecture, one of the three living ethical positions on war, the others being pacifism and just war. Now, we need to explain realism a bit further. It holds that warfare is a reality in the relations among political communities and leaders, to which the ethical standards of civic morality cannot be applied. Realism is at least as old as the Melian dialogue, which takes place in chapter 17 of the Greek historian Thucydides' book, History of the Peloponnesian War, in which Machiavelli surely knew. Thucydides describes a meeting between the leaders of Melos and the Athenian generals who were threatening them with a superior force. After suggesting that they both speak frankly because their peoples are absent, the Athenian leaders demand surrender. They explain, "For ourselves, we shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire or now attacking you because of some wrong that you've done us, since you know as well as we do that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must." When the Melians reply that they will trust in their allies, hope for fortune, pray to the gods, the Athenians reply, "Of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a necessary law of their nature, they rule wherever they can. And it is not as if we were the first to make this law. We found it existing. All we do is make use of it, knowing that you and everybody else would do the same as we do." The Melians refused to surrender. After battles and eventually a siege, they did surrender, and the Athenians executed all their grown men, sold the women and children for slaves, and inhabited Melos with their own colonists. By the way, that was not unusual behavior. Sieges were often the bloodiest form of warfare right into the early modern period, or even to the 20th century. Much later, in the early modern period, the Athenians' attitude would be called raison d'etat, reasons of state, meaning the national interest in state behavior can't be subjected to normal or civic moral standards. It's the view expressed by the American Civil War General William Tecumseh Sherman after he burned Atlanta and marched to the sea, destroying much Confederate property. He's supposed to have declared in justification, "War is hell." He meant that war is already an environment with no morality and no good. The sole aim is to end it as quickly as possible. Well, the prince is undeniably the most famous classic of political realism, and one of the first that tries to apply international realism to domestic affairs, to political theory itself, to ruling a state. Leaders, of course, had acted this way before, and historians had recorded it, but philosophers had not advocated and justified it. Now, Machiavelli explicitly says that he's talking about real, not ideal politics, about what must be done in the actual world. In an unvirtuous world, pure virtue, he says, is suicide. And he clearly implies that the end justifies the means. Stable rule, not justice, is what matters. He calls this his new order of political thought. This is the famous Machiavelli, the Machiavelli of the Prince, but it is only one part of Machiavelli's view. His other famous book, also published after his death, was his discourses on the first 10 books of Titus Livy. That is, the Roman historian Livy's famous account of the history of the Roman Republic from its founding to the reign of Augustus. Machiavelli's book is both different from and more comprehensive than The Prince. The Prince can rightly be regarded as one part of a larger perspective, which is given in the discourses. Now, as noted before, governments are either hereditary principalities or republics. Which a society ought to be depends on its circumstances. All Aristotle's types of government are brief and changeable. All are subject to fortune. All states endure, he says, improvement or decline, not stasis. Principalities are right for some societies for some period of time, but not for others. Republics are right for other societies and times. Machiavelli believes in what we might call either or, that there are strict types of regimes fit for certain circumstances, and the two can't be mixed. Laws, social conditions, and governmental policies must cohere to one type or another. One must choose one or the other way to rule. One can't combine the virtues of divergent types of political authority. The middle course is always bad. The ruler must either be, as he says, perfectly good or magnificently bad. Machiavelli's model of a republic is clear: Rome. Early in its history, from 509 BCE to around 27 BCE, Rome was a republic with a host of special political institutions that spread power out before the Senate eventually lost power to the emperor. This matters for us because in law and politics, Republican Rome would later be regarded as a model republic by nearly all the early modern political philosophers. Now, in Rome, there were assemblies or councils elected separately by patricians or landed nobility and plebeians or commoners, whose members, they were called magistrates, were elected and produced legislation. There was a plebeian tribune, a ruler of the council, who could call the Senate into session and propose legislation to it. There was a patrician senate, which oversaw the assemblies, was presided over by a consul, in effect an executive power. And there was a temporary dictator who could be appointed in times of crisis. Notice here the complexity and sophistication in providing balancing institutions. The Roman law also distinguished jus privatum from jus publicum, or what we call civil law from criminal law. Civil law concerns offenses against, criminal law concerns offenses against the state. A citizen is robbed or murdered. The complainant is not the victim or his or her relatives, but all citizens, in effect, the whole civitas. Civil law, on the other hand, concerns private offenses or complaints between the cives or citizens. Civil also distinguished associations of citizens from the military, government, and eventually ecclesiastical institutions. This is the background for what in the 18th century will be called civil society. It comes from the Latin societas civilis. Remember, this all goes back to Aristotle's koinonia politicae. Now, Machiavelli thought that the Roman Republic was indeed great. It was a functioning republic for over 400 years, after all. Its multiple institutions allowed it to balance power. It managed to encourage virtue and public spiritedness in its leaders, and it maintained its military vitality for a very long time. But like all things, eventually it declined. Here Machiavelli is making himself part of what we will call the modern civic republican tradition, which believes citizens, at least free male property owners, whoever counts as a citizen, should govern themselves, as in Aristotle, and they could do so only if they retained the virtues of republicanism, especially honor and a willingness to fight. This is the old notion of the warrior aristocrat, which was familiar from feudalism and much further back to Aristotle and even before. And Machiavelli was aware, as other historians were, that such martial virtue can be periodically lost. This is similar to the view of the medieval Arab sociologist Ibn Khaldun. A century earlier, in his Muqaddimah, or Prolegomena on History, he gave an account of Arab and North African society. Khaldun argued that tribal, martial, evangelical asabiya, or social solidarity, thrives in the nomadic tribes, but decays after conquest of the city, because the commercial city life is individualistically competitive and inimical to martial virtue. Khaldun used this to explain the cyclic conquests of cities by nomadic warlords. This is part of the civic republican tradition. A republic is an association of politically active citizens who both own property and are capable of self-defense. Those are linked, by the way, because property owners have land to defend and have the money to buy weapons and armor, which commercial interests are apt to undermine. And Machiavelli openly criticizes the effect of Christianity. The Church of Rome has harmed Italy, he says. Christianity itself has reduced the vigor and martial virtue of the citizens. This is the classical versus the Christian viewpoint in the middle of Renaissance humanism. In the discourses, Machiavelli takes a broader view that puts what he has told us in The Prince into perspective. Because the world is not mostly good, human nature is both good and bad, history does not progress. The political cannot be determined by ideal virtue. Machiavelli writes, and I quote, "It seems to me that the world has always been in the same condition, and that in it there has been just as much good as there is evil, but that this evil and this good have varied from province to province. There is no such thing as progress overall." Still, when republics are possible, Machiavelli says they are morally superior to principalities. It's just that they're fragile. He concludes that after a long discussion, taking 400 years of Republican Rome as an example, and he disagrees with Livy. Quote, "Nothing is more futile and more inconstant than are the masses. So says our author, Titus Livy, and so say all other historians," unquote. Machiavelli agrees. The masses are fickle and ungrateful and prone to unlawful behavior. That doesn't sound very Republican, but here Machiavelli takes the modern view. He says, quote, "For the failing of which writers blame the masses, any body of men one cares to select may be blamed, and especially princes. For anyone who does not regulate his conduct by laws will make the same mistakes as the masses are guilty of," unquote. In short, he is lowering the ideal by which we judge the virtue of those with political power. He concludes then, the nature of the masses is no more reprehensible than the nature of princes. The populace is more prudent and stable and of sounder judgment than the princes. If account be of all the disorders due to populaces and of all those due to princes, and of all the glories won by populaces and all those won by princes, it will be found that alike in goodness and in glory, the populace is far superior. So, in practical terms, all things considered, the populace, hence a republic, is generally more likely to govern well than a prince. He continues, and if princes are superior to populaces in drawing up laws, codes of civil life, statutes, and new institutions, the populace is so superior in sustaining what has been instituted that it indubitably adds to the glory of those who have instituted. That is, what the populace is good at is not so much coming to know the right policy or instituting it, but listening to two men or politicians argue for opposing policies, and they are superior in being able to pick the more trustworthy man and the more trustworthy argument. So government by the populace is actually better than government by the princes. That's Machiavelli's conclusion. However, he says, again, everything is dependent on circumstance. It usually takes a prince to establish a reform or republic. That the people cannot do. Creation requires a single person, a single powerful individual. So there's a symbiosis here between the power of the prince and the power of the people. And in the discourses, he still says violence can still be good. Quote, for it is the man who uses violence to spoil things, not the man who uses it to mend them, that is blameworthy. So based on the discourses, we can say Machiavelli does not throw out political ideals exactly. He merges the ideal into the real and asks about the real costs and effects of acting according to ideals, when you can and when you cannot. In politics, what matters is the kind of state that's created and maintained. It must be secure and orderly. It ought to be just and virtuous. But whatever must be done to create such a state is legitimate. But still, the world being what it is, all will decline. The great danger for both princes and republics is not that the commoners, but the jockeying of ambitious, rich, powerful men. That's always the danger. What then is Machiavelli's legacy for us? Well, the first thing is obvious, his realism, in which we do not assume the rightness of use of civic moral norms in the political realm, that is, in the realm of power. We can also say he raises the problem of dirty hands. That's not his phrase, but a modern phrase. That is politics such that one inevitably acts immorally, dirtying one's hands? The realist says, the political realist says, yes, and so morality ought not be applied. He writes many things, as Machiavelli writes many things that are in fact amoral, especially in The Prince, as we've seen. Given his life, his flexible allegiances, he may well view political agents as unable consistently to follow moral rules, unless Fortuna puts them in the position to support a stable republic. Fortuna can make us do bad things, and in those cases, failing to do the bad things leads to even worse things. Now, the way this is sometimes understood by philosophers, as we saw, is to say that Machiavelli is amoral and that the ends justify the means. But it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, to say the ends justify the means is not amoral or immoral. It depends on your moral theory, as we'll see later on. If, for example, you're a moral consequentialist, if you think an act is good when its good results outweigh its bad results, then the end can indeed justify the means. The most famous kind of consequentialism we'll later see is utilitarianism, which says that the morally right acts are those which provide the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. So is lying wrong? Maybe. But if lying to a maniac killer, saying that there is no one else in the house, saves lives, does it become right? If so, the end is justifying the means. We'll see more of this kind of moral theory later. So is Machiavelli simply a moral consequentialist, or even a utilitarian? saying one ought to do whatever results in the most good consequences for all human beings affected? No, not quite either. Certainly Machiavelli is saying that in politics, one cannot simply follow civic duty, but must do what will lead to the best outcome. But he's also taking the ultimate end, what counts as the best outcome, to be something like stable rule with, if possible, glory for the ruler. In The Prince, this comes down to glory for the prince. In the discourses, it is more like the self-ruling vitality of the republic, which enhances the glory of its founder. Both are good, but the latter is better. The goal, then, is a practical political goal which transcends the kind of virtues the ancient philosophers and the scholastics were concerned with. But the danger of loss of rule, conquest, or disorder trumps everything and justifies anything for Machiavelli. And it leaves us with a permanent question. Does politics demand behavior that is ethically immoral? Suppose you can only save your country from destruction by an alliance with an evil empire, or by lying, or by allowing some few people to suffer undeservedly, or by unfairly firing a minister to secure the government's popularity, or sending 1,000 men to certain brutal death, so that the next 3,000 men can climb over their corpses to victory. In the discourses, no less than The Prince, Machiavelli is clear that the answer is yes. We will return to this issue at the end of the course, although it will be with us throughout. It's part of politics. So Machiavelli is the beginning of the eclipse of the ancient and medieval tradition that only moral virtue, virtuous populations and/or leaders, can form a good or just polity. From Plato through the medievals, the idea that a just society could be constructed without virtuous citizens or virtuous rulers would be insane. Plato believed the polis must be ordered according to an ideal justice that the wisdom seekers would try to know. Aristotle believed that the polis exists to foster a virtuous life and considered ethics part of politics, since ethics governs one's relations to other members of the polis. Thus, for Aristotle, politics is always an inherently ethically relevant activity. Politics is not a means to an end, some other end that goes beyond politics. Politics is the kind of activity that free, equal citizens engage in, and it spawns its own virtues. Machiavelli offers that political society will often have to get along without moral virtue and find a way to be just and stable without it. The social contract thinkers that will follow him, and we will soon see, are going to push that point even further, but with less violence. They develop a new kind of moral justification of a polity, not based in moral virtue, but on a social contract to serve rational self-interest. Now, in this, they go beyond Machiavelli, it is true. But at the same time, their own work is scarcely conceivable without Machiavelli's inversion, turning the tables on the whole tradition of Western political theory.